Most unlikely of villains, schools of brain and pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? Lair of the cerebral bore has shown so much more. Release your brains at the door.
Welcome back, everybody. This is part 2 of our Sanity episode. We covered all the systems that you normally think of when you think of Sanity and role-playing games in the first episode. Now we're going to delve into some other ones. So I'm going to hand it off to, I guess I'm being rude here, because if you missed the first episode, you might not know who we are. I of course, am Jason. I do the Nerds RPG Variety Cast in no particular order. We have Arlen Walker from Live from Pelham's Wasteland, Carl Rodriguez from The Geomologist Presents, and BJ Boyd from The Arcane Alienist. How are you gentlemen doing this morning?
Great.
Doing
Awake.
good.
Got some coffee going.
Doing good.
Great. So we're going to let Arlen launch this off because he's researched some other games that are a little more off the beaten path that we wanted to talk about. And we also will probably get into some free league stuff this time and some other stuff. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Arlen.
Yeah. So I think there are kind of a number of things that I ended up thinking about after our discussion last time. One of the places that I thought would be interesting to start is something that I didn't actually mention on the Discord, but I think it's kind of an interesting place to go with this concept of sanity. And I think there's a sort of almost more general category that has to do with kind of player control over their character or ability to kind of define their character versus, their character's actions or decisions or things being, say, mechanically defined, often as a result of like enemy interference or things like that. And that sort of, I think, fits in with a sort of layman's understanding of things like, insanity, that often there's an element of kind of loss of agency to the person who is suffering that is based on their kind of inability to function in normal society based on, the way that we all understand the world because of the divergence from the norm, shall we say. So I ended up thinking about the various Burning Wheel games as an interesting example of this, that many of them, so Burning Wheel, and I don't know if Mouse Guard has very much like this, but definitely Torchbearer and Miseries and Misfortunes, actually, which is kind of a weird one within the sort of weird zone of Burning Wheel games in particular, because it's mechanically sort of like a blend of a weird super hacked version of BX with Burning Wheel core into this kind of strange thing that is designed for playing in 1640s France. But one of the, I think, interesting ideas is that morale checks are not limited to enemies. And that's a sort of a summary of what I'm getting at, is that essentially characters in combat will have to test their morale at various different times. And there's a pretty strict procedure for the situations where characters will test their morale. And it's not limited to enemies. It also refers to player characters, that a character who is basically getting the worst of a combat will likely find themselves mechanically in a position where they can't fight anymore because of their kind of inability to sort of stick it out and grit their teeth and keep going despite the difficulty. Which I think it's an interesting twist. Often I think we think of morale as something that is sort of enemies only, and especially in a lot of the sort of old school games where it appears more often that, enemies check morale when, as a way for the game master to decide whether they want to, run to try to live and fight another day, but that players are making that decision for their characters. But I think this is kind of an interesting twist on that concept, that morale is sort of not just like whether you stand and fight or whether you run, but it's also a measure of your kind of, your spirits and your elan that can kind of carry the day in dangerous situations.
Yeah, if I could chime in there, I know we'll probably talk about this a little later, perhaps, but Twilight 2000 has that mechanic, right? They have effect two. One is coolness under fire, where if you're ambushed or shot at, You have to roll basically a morale check or drop prone, and you can't do anything for a round. And they also have a stress track. Not only do they have a wound track, but they have a stress track that can accumulate. And if that reaches your threshold, then you are also incapacitated. You're not like bleeding out or anything, but you're definitely like curled up in a ball or can't function or panicking. However you want to play for your character, that sort of trauma that comes through a combat or tough fatigue situation. So,
well,
there are definitely mechanics in that.
Yeah. Well, and the coolness under fire element in particular, I think, is a great way to model how suppression works in more realistic firefights, at least as I understand it. That, part of the point of what is often kind of my understanding when you have kind of trained soldiers versus less trained or less practiced fighters, that part of what happens is that there are a lot of bullets flying. I don't know why that took so difficult, but the U.S. military found something, a ridiculous number of bullets fired over the course of the Vietnam War per confirmed enemy killed. So there's a lot of bullets in the air, but not necessarily that great danger of actually being hit by one. And it's more about the danger of that being around. And if you're not kind of prepared for that and in a good position of cover where you're pretty safe, then you keep your head down and don't shoot back. And that allows the other side to maneuver around your cover and actually, take aim shots essentially.
Right. There's some famous studies, and some have been debunked a little bit. SLA Marshall's things have been thrown into question a little bit, but there are studies where, like, especially from World War II, where the idea that maybe only, and these aren't the exact numbers from the studies, so I'm doing it off the top of my head, where like 1 in 10 men actually fight, something like that. And there's some that'll actually, we're talking about your side, friendly side, some people won't shoot at all. Some people just kind of shoot in the air, but you only have a small number that actually will actively engage. Obviously, the more elite the force is, the higher that number goes up, right? But we're talking like you're just your general military. So that kind of goes, which goes into hirelings and henchmen in role-playing games.
Well, and the number that I remember is about 20%, and that of the 80%, most of them will probably be willing to shoot, like to put bullets in the air, but they're not going to do much of kind of, aiming to specifically take down targets. And that the result of that gets exactly into that there's a lot of bullets in the air, but not necessarily nearly as much kind of direct danger from most of them, because a lot of them are just being sort of fired in the general direction. Obviously, the bullet doesn't care whether it was fired in the general direction or a specific aim shot, so you're definitely still dangerous. You don't want to be in that situation, right. But that it is a something that a trained and professional force can kind of utilize to their advantage by keeping up a level of firepower to suppress the enemy. And that coolness under fire is a great kind of example of how that works, as opposed to, I think, a lot of other especially I think about kind of D20-ish games that have tried to adapt those concepts into a hit armor class thing. And I feel like almost all of them have not done a very good job of it, that it feels like it's, often it's a specific kind of style of fighting that you have to take. And I think that's sort of the opposite of what you want. That part of the point of suppression is that all bullets cause suppression, even the ones that aren't necessarily as well aimed. Right. But it's a complicated thing that,
and just to show in the media how this is actually well shown, I feel the sort of idea of coolness under fire and stress under fire, and what Arlen alluded to is when a soldier is compromised, the morale is compromised. Is in Band of Brothers, the episode, I believe it's episode 4, Carentan, where they kind of have this one soldier, they go through his experience and how he goes from panicking and even losing his sight mentally from fire to being a soldier able to take the combat under fire. So it's pretty good study there in that particular episode. I hope we're not diverging too much, but I think that's
no, it's fine.
Morale and sanity.
Yeah, morale and sanity. I think morale is really closely related to sanity and trauma and all the stuff that we've been talking about, right? It's kind of a different approach towards a similar end in some ways, I think, is sort of what I was getting at with the discussion about miseries and misfortunes. I will add from the other direction, I think that the kind of extended finale sequence in Full Metal Jacket does a really good job of demonstrating kind of the other way this can work, that there's a whole bunch of Marines who are basically pinned down by one shooter because the shooter is a sniper and is aiming, and they all don't want to expose themselves, and they basically, one by one get shot and wounded until they can kind of gather up the group courage to rush the building and end up storming the sniper's nest essentially.
Right.
Which I think is
yeah, definitely. And when we talk about the other side too, your more elite soldiers, I mean, you see that in your anecdotal stories from like World War II, where your Japanese military was huge on the charge, right? I mean, they had to have bayonet mounts for like their medium light machine guns and things, and they would charge. And against most of the forces they fought, especially early in the war and before we got involved, most forces would break when the Japanese forces charged. Where the Marines, and how apocryphal this is or not, but the story you always hear is the Marines would just stand there and shoot. And
the Marines also had Garands
they were highly trained. Well,
that helps too.
Yeah. I mean, they were highly trained, but a modern book on all this would be, we're getting off topic, but if you're interested in this, folks, a modern book on this would be Dave Grossman's On Killing is often cited. Although again, that's based on martial stuff. So it's a little, but Grossman is considered he's brought in by police forces and all as a trainer on use of force and the willingness to take life. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah.
BJ.
So I was
going to say another good movie film version of it that maybe more what you would want to think of, and a little closer to fantasy, is The Last Samurai, where they've trained a bunch of peasant conscripts to shoot rifles. They've been trained by a U.S. cavalry officer to take out the last holdouts of the samurai class. But when these people who've grown up with these stories of how awesome and fearful, badass samurais are, they get in the field and they start wetting their pants and firing in the air, and then they break as soon as the samurai get within spitting distance of them. Mm-hmm. They just like they collectively fail their morale check. How realistic that is to the history, I don't know, but it at least is a good dramatic portrayal of why.
I mean, part of it is that like the Boshin War is a pretty complicated piece of history for a lot of reasons, not just for and The Last Samurai is kind of an interesting sort of fantastical version of that doesn't capture much of the historical events very well, but I think a lot of people feel like it captures the kind of spirit of the historical period really well. And so
I was disappointed there was no Ray-Ban placement in that movie.
Well, so another game that I was thinking would be worth discussing is Blades in the Dark, or the general kind of Forged in the Dark system, in which player characters, because in the Blades in the Dark systems, generally not almost all necessarily, but a lot of the roles are made by player characters. The GM doesn't roll a whole lot. Normally the player characters will roll to resist things and stuff like that. And characters will have a stress track. And depending on the particular situation, it'll have a certain, different games have different numbers of slots in the stress track. And there's a whole kind of strategy to using your stress track, because you can, as a player, use your stress track to add dice to your pool when you're when you're going to make a roll, which can be pretty significant in a game like Blades in the Dark, where what you do is you just count the highest die that you get. So, the highest die on 1d6 versus the highest die on 2d6 can be pretty significant. Of course, you could still roll 2 2s and have wasted your stress basically. But part of the idea is that this stress track is also really important for downtime as well, that there's a whole back and forth with kind of building up stress over the course of a mission and then trying to work off stress over the course of downtime. And at some point your character will basically fill up with stress, and they will have essentially a breakdown, and they will be irreparably changed by that. They will add some sort of condition essentially that reflects the change to their personality that has happened because they have got to the breaking point of their stress. But I think it's kind of an interesting thing because it ties in so well with this kind of two-part cycle to Blades in the Dark or Forged in the Dark play, right? That you need to spend your resources on getting your stress down while you're in downtime, and then you go into the kind of high tension action sequence of the sort of normal gameplay, and you spend all your stress trying to succeed at whatever you're trying to do. And so there's a really interesting kind of back and forth there. And in particular, I think Blades in the Dark does a really good job of emphasizing that the way you get rid of stress is generally fairly self-destructive. Which I think is kind of an interesting point, that, most of the characters are not going to get rid of stress by doing, things like helping little old ladies across the street. They're going to, they're going to drink themselves into oblivion, or, all of the various other vices that might be not so good for you long term, but are good for relieving stress.
Well, or at least making you forget about it for a little while.
Or at least
right?
making you forget about
putting it off.
Yeah.
It doesn't really solve any problems. It just kicks the can down the road, right?
Yeah,
yeah. So.
And then another system that I mentioned is Best Left Buried, which Best Left Buried is kind of an interesting one.
This is the disgusting game you mentioned, right? No, go ahead.
No,
I joke, folks. Let me give a little explanation here. So I ran Best Left Buried, the first edition, when it first came out, for a group, including Pete Jones over at Dragons Are Real podcast and some other folks, Darren Green, Arfed, and we just found some holes and some problems in the system. And then we found some interviews from the author where he talked about, well, he kind of released it before it was done, to let people figure out the problems with it and all this. Supposedly the second edition has fixed a lot of that. So second edition Best Left Buried might be a great game, but the first edition, it left a bad taste in my mouth. So that's where that comment came from. But go ahead, Arlen.
Yeah, but basically what I understand from hearing the author talk about the game is that he was really interested in sort of the idea of sort of old school, kind of the grind, similar to what Torchbearer does, this idea of the characters getting worn down by the experience of being adventurers. But he also really didn't like old school mechanics. And so he basically did his own thing with the mechanics. But one of the mechanical bits is that characters will have an attribute, sort of a narrative meta currency called grip. And grip is used basically as essentially used in play as a narrative meta currency to reroll dice. And so you can reroll your own dice. You can also force enemies to reroll their dice at times. At least you could in one of the versions. I don't remember if you still can, but I think you still can, because it's basically, like bashing them with the shield as they're about to strike and things like that. I don't remember exactly. But part of the idea is that as your grip gets lower and lower, grit works sort of like hit points, where if you run out, you're SOL, right? That you really don't want to run out of grip. But player characters can regain grip by taking essentially coping mechanisms for their experiences, which I think is a really kind of clever twist, that rather than being something kind of inflicted on a player by the vagaries of the dice or a particularly bad save or something like that, that it's actually the player's choice to do something that is kind of long-term harmful to them, the same sort of, vices that aren't good for you long-term, like in Blades in the Dark. But it's really, I think it really illustrates this idea that is really central to at least my understanding about mental health, that a lot of the kind of stuff that we see that we might associate with things like trauma, or in the kind of blanket term for insanity, a lot of that is really kind of coping mechanisms that are people who are sort of trying to deal with those issues more than it is kind of those issues themselves, right? That, people who have, for instance, PTSD and use or abuse of alcohol or drugs or things like that, that's really not necessarily that's sort of, I guess the way to phrase it is that that's sort of a attempt to deal with the trauma in a way that is ultimately kind of not as healthy as it could be, as opposed to being the trauma itself, if that makes sense. And that I like the way that Best Left Buried puts that in the players' play style, essentially, that the players choose to, start drinking a little harder than they should as a way to deal with the horrors that they have seen, rather than, well, you rolled terribly on a save, so we're going to roll on the random table for what your new issue is, that sort of thing.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that's fairly unrealistic about, I mean, again, it's a fantasy game and people are responding to horrors that we don't actually experience in real life, but something like the way it's sometimes handled is, you don't just develop a random psychiatric symptom, close your eyes, flip open the DSM, put down your finger, and that's what you got now. I mean, most people are going to respond by shutting down, not being able to sleep. They may develop an addiction, or they may just be irritable, but they're not, I was kind of looking at some of even the stuff in 5e that are options the DMG gives you. And it's like, one exposure to a pretty serious trauma is not going to give you obsessive compulsive traits. That's something that has a completely different etiology in the real world.
Yeah.
But we seem to do that sometimes in some of these games where we want to inflict reflect the fact that these horrible experiences can cause people to have mental health problems, but it's not very, it doesn't model reality very well, which
and especially when I think it's not as kind of subtle an understanding, especially of like the causes or the relationship between causes and symptoms. I think that's a big place that you can run into issues where, if you have like in the example, the random table of mental health issues, and half of them are what we might call neurodivergences rather than like trauma responses. And it's like, that's not really right. That's not how it works, right? You're kind of born one way or the other. You're not with a lot of those neurodivergences. It's not like you suddenly develop the inability to, recognize people's faces because you witnessed a traumatic experience, unless you had like a spell cast on you as part of the traumatic experience.
Or like you had a stroke in a particular part of the
or you
brain.
Had a stroke, or or you got knocked out by a battle axe to the head and your helmet saved you, but you got some brain damage. That could do it, but it wouldn't be the sort of thing where, as response to horrific trauma, that's what a character would start experiencing.
And maybe that's a good segue into how this new adaptation of the Call of Cthulhu mythos that Green Ronin is coming out with. Cthulhu, is it Cthulhu Unleashed? Is that what it's called? Cthulhu Awakens?
Cthulhu Awakens, yeah.
Is that they're using this concept of alienation, as opposed to calling it madness. They even say like madness is used as a casual term for mental illness, phenomenon, et cetera, that is neurological, social, et cetera, and all that. But they kind of change it in a way, and maybe this is for good or for bad, we don't know. We haven't seen any implementation yet, of course, that's in the Kickstart, but they're calling it something different, which maybe kind of alleviates a lot of these problems, where we're calling this exposure to the unknown and the unknowable as madness. And in fact, they're calling it alienation, and they have a way to track that. I think it's a good take on this idea of what the mythos can do to you.
Well, I think alienation is a really good name because it gets into what we sort of talked about last time with the way that, the people in the Lovecraftian mythos who have experienced these kind of mythos events are, sort of more rationally able to deal with the reality of existence than basically everybody else. But that because of that, they are sort of unable to deal with the human society that still has its blinders on, right? And they talk a little bit about that in the whatchamacallit, webpage, the blog post
The
that
blog,
I
yeah.
linked. They specifically have a thing, failing a test provides enlightenment and terror. And then later on in the same paragraph, accumulating enlightenment and terror may eventually lead to distortions, habits of thought that are rational within the context of your extraordinary experiences, but interfere with more prosaic matters. And I think that's exactly sort of what we were getting at with this idea of what sort of Lovecraftian madness, doing air quotes, is that it's actually totally rational within the context of this experience that almost no one else has ever had, and that but that makes it very difficult to, you go back to the cafe where everybody else is having a nice day and you're like, there's fucking deep ones out there, what are we going to do? And they're like, what the hell do you mean? And you're totally unable to engage with people who sort of haven't seen the truth yet.
So it's basically like the movie Don't Look Up. No, sorry.
I haven't seen the movie Don't Look Up yet.
Yeah.
Is it Don't Look Up, or what's
Or is
that
it-
other movie with the glasses?
No, the one with DiCaprio and
Oh yeah. Don't look
with
up.
the,
About
with the comet or
meteorite.
something.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
meteorite or comet.
and nobody
Yeah.
wants to believe him.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever been around anybody who's had any kind of profound experience. You probably have, whether it's a traumatic experience or even a very moving, spiritual experience, or it just changes their entire understanding of the world, for good or bad. But a lot of times, those are the people that it's like, man, can you talk about something else for a minute? Because that defines their existence.
Well, so this is going to be a super nerdy example, but St. Augustine wrote a number of books, basically all of which are worth reading. But the one that happens to be my favorite is Confessions, which is not really a piece of kind of theological argument the way that almost all the rest of them are, City of God and all that sort of stuff. Confessions is basically a sort of memoir, maybe the first one that exists, at least that we have access to. There's some case to be made for some other pieces of ancient world literature that sort of fit the definition, but Confessions is basically complete, and it's really brilliant literature in addition to being a memoir. And there are a couple of moments that are like that. In particular, part of what Augustine talks about is that his sort of life before conversion, where he was a wild man and a pagan and out partying, and there's a number of kind of famous sequences. The stealing pears element, which I think is in chapter 2. I don't remember exactly, but stealing pears is a really wonderful sequence for a sort of explanation of the nature of evil that seems to really characterize Augustine's thought in a lot of other places. But specifically, he talks about his kind of moment of conversion. And it really is, I think, like that he has this kind of realization of this idea that it's sort of non-rational in a way, but it is not non-real for him, right? That he has this experience and realizes that he believes, and he's sort of a part of the believers now. And it's, totally transformative as he describes it. Now, he may be sort of making a case in this particular piece of literature with a sort of didactic bent about, the nature of Christianity and all that sort of stuff. But at the very least, I think it's a really powerful thing to read and see this person who, and in particular, of course, because that's the beginning of a lot of, or just about everything else that we have of Augustine's, right? That basically every other piece of writing that we have from him is from after his conversion to Christianity and is about Christian theology. And therefore, this moment is sort of the only thing that we have from before he believed, one of the sort of church fathers. And that's kind of a fascinating thing to read. At least I thought it was.
No, I agree with that. I think to swing it back into the role playing, the idea of that experience, though, of knowing something that and nobody else believes you or nobody else knows about it. We see. I'm very curious to see how this Green Ronin pulls that off. When that comes out, because other games have tried that. I mean, obviously that's kind of the conceit behind a ton of these games, whether it's Call of Cthulhu, as you learn your mythos score goes up higher, or even Delta Green, where obviously or the Laundry Files if you want to play BRP. But all these games have this idea you have secret knowledge, or a bunch of the White Wolf stuff did that, right? The World of Darkness
even
stuff did
I think
right?
I think even versions of D&D have had a lot of it, right? Like
Sure.
clerics, right? Clerics in D&D apparently get their spells from deities. Are there any atheists in Faerun, right? That's kind of an interesting question.
Well, they've got a prescribed fate of atheists. Atheists are bound to the wall in the fugue plane, and they're slowly absorbed over time.
Well, the point being, like,
Yeah.
I guess the better way to put it is, are there any like reasonable people living in that world who come to the conclusion that there are no gods at all, the way that people come to that conclusion in our world when there are clerics who are casting healing spells regularly that are powered by the divine? Like,
Yeah,
that's kind of
that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think you could have people that are agnostic, that don't follow any particular faith, or that have a dislike of the gods, or hate the gods or whatever. But I don't think it's short of.
It seems like
short of falling
really
into maybe. Yeah, short of falling into.
Who doesn't believe in the god's existence at all, right? When you have such clear evidence by comparison,
particularly Faerun, where the gods show up every other Tuesday to.
Well, yeah. I guess maybe some of the other settings might be a better example.
Yeah. It's like ancient Greece. I mean, there really wasn't a question. You didn't have people that didn't believe Zeus and all them were out there, right? For the most part, at least. I kind of want to redirect a little bit, though.
Let's go back to RPGs.
Let's talk about, as we finish up the show, let's get into some of the Free League stuff, and particularly like in Aliens with the stress track. And I guess what I want to look at a little bit is the idea that these games give you, as you get more stressed out or you move further down the tracks, and we touched on this earlier, you get better at certain things. And maybe is that realistic? Do we like that? Do we like, and to some degree, you're gambling here, because I get better at this. I'm not so good at this, but I'm better at this. But then all of a sudden you pass the threshold, and now it all falls apart, right?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, we did talk about Twilight 2000, but another game that does that, or not the newest version, but the old version of Iron Kingdoms, used to have like a spiral wheel, a stress tracker, and then you'd kind of get better. And then you get worse, and you get better, and then you get worse, and then you finally go out in a blaze of glory. But that's kind of interesting. Have this kind of wound/stress tracker. But I guess we'll talk about. I don't know about the other Free League games. I have them, but I don't know.
Well, and
other than Twilight 2000.
Well, I was thinking Aliens, because Aliens famous.
I don't know if any of the other Free League games have much related to that. I think Alien is the only one that really uses that mechanic. Although it's really cool in Alien, you could probably put it into other games if you wanted to. Like if you wanted to try a version of Forbidden Lands or Coriolis or
let's talk about Alien. Let's talk about that stress track in Alien. Have you played that, Arlen?
I have not played it, but I've read it.
Okay.
Well, do you want me to talk about it, or do you want to talk about it?
The character sheet would have to have at the peak when you're about to break. You should have game over, man.
Well, it's funny because there's an OSR.
Maybe you haven't been paying attention to current events. We just got our asses kicked, man.
Yeah, there's an OSR-ish Black Hat game called Stay Frosty that actually has kind of the same mechanic that I actually like better because it's simpler. I'm actually a big fan of Stay Frosty, but Arlen, go ahead and break down.
So the way Alien works is that it at the core is this standard Mutant Year Zero resolution system where you have a pool of D6s and you're trying to get sixes. Basically, if you get at least 1 6 in your total roll, generally that's enough for a success. Sometimes with opposed rolls, you might need more than that because certain enemies will have attributes that they're rolling, and they could get really lucky and roll multiple sixes on their roll, things like that. But in general, for most stuff, and some of the games, the part of what's weird is that the games use different systems for difficulty. So some of them reduce the dice in the pool, and some of them require more successes. And require more successes is a much less granular source of difficulty, which I think is an interesting thing. But anyway, the point being, in Alien, you have a pool of D6s. Well, you also get D6s for stress. And the way it works essentially is that if you get a 6 on those dice, it still counts as a success, right? That you essentially are adding dice to your total pool. The problem is if a 1 comes up on those dice, because that's not good. That's when your stress has gotten the better of you, essentially. And I think I don't remember. I think it's anytime a 1 comes up on any of the stress dice, although it might be like you need more 1s than 6s on stress dice or something. I don't remember exactly, but I think what happens, if I remember correctly, is that if you show a 1 on your stress dice, you have basically the stress has gotten the better of you, and you have a breakdown, a chaotic moment, whatever you want to call it. You have your period of madness essentially.
So what do we so I'd like to go around and see, what do you guys think? How do you like that push your luck mechanic where you can get that you can get that mechanical advantage, but at some point obviously it's going to bite you in the butt. It's kind of like a berserker, right? It's the same idea as the berserker where you get all these bonuses, but if you kill the enemies before your berserk rage runs out, now you're possibly going to be attacking your friends. So it's kind of that same dynamic. BJ, what are your thoughts on that?
Just as a game player, I like it. I think it's an interesting resource management, push your luck. You got to make hard choices. I like that. I think that's a very satisfying game mechanic. As far as how realistic it is, I think we're beyond that kind of consideration at this point. Now we're looking for what's fun.
I will say,
I agree with that.
As you, just to hop in for a second, I think that there's a sort of realism component, but there's also sort of narrativism component that is worth considering too. The way that idea of kind of, even more likely to get a success, but also the consequences of failure are more significant, really fits in with the sort of narrative arc that you see especially in horror stories, where it's, okay, it's do or die time. Either we're going to, blast the alien or game over.
Right.
But the idea that you're steeling yourself for some heroic feat or some last stand, and you push through, and then when the crisis is past, you just fall apart.
Yeah.
Right.
That's kind of realistic.
it's kind of actually mirrored in like the Aliens movie, right? When I think it's Frost, when he goes, does it Frost? I can't remember. The guy with the guy goes, let's rock, and they start shooting they have a stress moment where they start shooting like crazy when they're not supposed to, because they're in the nuclear reactor, and of course that has a consequence later down the road of the whole thing's going to blow up.
Yeah.
So so that's kind of mirrored, I think, in Aliens pretty well. It's interesting. I think that mechanic is similar, not quite the same, but in Wrath and Glory, you have a wrath dice that also can give you aces or I guess twos in a poker type of parlance, and that like if you roll a 6, something good happens, but you roll a 1, and it's even though you can succeed like in the task, there's a complication. So I think that mechanic, something like that, I don't know. I guess purists would say that's a little gonzo, really. That you succeed, but then you have a complication. What the hell is that? You should just succeed, but maybe that makes for a more interesting narrative down the line.
That's the way the Genesis system that Fantasy Flight, Star Wars, and their other games are based on. You have to kind of interpret the dice pool. Go, oh, this can be failure, but with a boon, or it can be success with a complication.
Right. Yeah. Hey, Carl, do you like overall, do you like the idea of the push your luck mechanic with like these stress systems in whatever game? It doesn't necessarily have to be, But
I like it. I mean, I think it because it contributes to the narrative. It makes for a more interesting story than just succeed or fail. I like the fact, like probably same thing in Aliens, that you can succeed, but still there's something screwed up that happens, which I think is kind of cool. It's always like, you see that in the literature, you see that in the movies. They succeed, but it's a Pyrrhic victory, or you succeed, but there's a cost, right? Say for example, even going back to Aliens, when what's her name, her and Gorman sacrifice themselves with their grenade, right? But then they lose. The Newt gets, because of the explosion, Newt gets trapped by herself, and of course is captured. Sorry, we're ruining Aliens for you. The movie's been out for
spoilers.
20 years.
Yeah, not to put a spoiler in the front for Aliens,
but yeah, there's so that they succeed in stopping the onrushing aliens, but Vasquez and Gorman's act, screws things up, throws a wrench in the works. I like that. That totally fits with the narrative.
Yeah, definitely. And if you don't have access to the leading edge Phoenix Command version of Aliens, and you've got to play this modern one to bring it back to RPGs. So we're good. So the one thing I like the idea of the push your luck mechanic. What I don't like, and one of the reasons I like second edition Unknown Armies, which we talked about last time, better than third edition. Third edition, your stress tracks are directly attached to your attributes. So as you move along these stress tracks, you might get stronger, but and the attributes are paired off. They're in pairs, kind of like in some of these other games, like Barney Dicker's League of Eternal Gentlemen, or League. Anyway, the point is.
Guardians.
Sorry, Guardians. Thank you, League of Eternal Guardians. There you go, Barney. We gave you a plug there.
I know.
Anyway, the point is, I don't know that I like the idea that, because you're going up in stress, one thing gets better, one thing gets worse. I kind of see that, the idea of maybe tunnel vision, and we see that with people getting high stress, you get tunnel vision, you get target fixation. We see that with, police officers and combatants, where they're not paying attention, then they get flanked by somebody. And that does happen in the real world. But at the same time, in Unknown Armies 3rd edition, because they paired attributes and it's like hard coded in there, some of it, the pairings don't make sense. Like, you know what I mean? And that's my problem with that, why I like second edition better. But overall, I do like the push your luck mechanic. And I think what's interesting is, and we'll kind of round this out, we're coming up to an hour, but
you're not going to let me talk about stress?
I am. Okay. I'm going to say something. I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay.
We're going to go around. We're going to go around the circle. There are interesting stress things, even in games where you don't think about them, like low fantasy gaming, which is a really interesting system. It's not really low fantasy, but it's closer to like it's maybe 5e level complexity. It's kind of more like 5e, but low fantasy gaming is a really interesting system. If you're interested in it, you can go see Jason Hobbs's actual plays. They're all over the place. But in that game, if you take certain injuries, you can actually get things. Like I was playing with him in his game, and my character got hit on the head, and it basically gave him a delusion that all of his companions were enemies, and he ended up attacking the party. Which goes back into maybe a little bit into Arlen's thing where you lose control of your character. But I don't have a problem with that as a player, because he said, this is your new, you see these as your enemies, but I got to decide how that played out. I got to decide how my PC acted. So that doesn't bother me. I know it would bother some people, but
they still talk about it.
Well, yeah, I know. I know one person we play with does, because I killed like 2 or 3 of the party members in the process. But it was a fun game. But anyway, these mechanics are spread out. Some are definitely better than others. But I think as long as we accept that what's happening in games is not real life, and like BJ warned us in the beginning, and Arlen warned us in the beginning of the last episode, don't try to get your knowledge of mental health issues from games. Don't use games as somewhere to learn about this stuff. Just accept it as all fiction, what's happening in the game. I think it does add to the game to have some of these mechanics in there. We're going to pass it off to everybody to kind of round out final thoughts or whatever you want to say. So Arlen, we're going to throw it to you first, because you're chomping at the bit here.
All right. So I've got like 4 things that I was thinking of. So first one, target fixation. One of the things that you don't get from movies is that you can't hear anything other than gunfire in a real firefight, which I learned playing video games, and was like, oh shit, shouting over the sound of a machine gun doesn't work. Like you can't, you just have to kind of trust that everybody's going to do their job, basically, because you can't really give orders anymore at that point, which I think is an interesting thing, and kind of goes into this idea of, fixation and stress causing certain particular behaviors. I really like the stress mechanic in the Alien game, although I will say I think it works better for the cinematic mode than for the campaign mode, which is to say that I think it's definitely like the odds of rolling a 1 on that 1d6 are low, but they're, to me, not low enough for players to take advantage of it when they really care about their characters, and that they're kind of not going to use this fun mechanic. Whereas in cinematic mode, I think where you're playing with house money, and therefore it's for those who don't know, Alien has two different, there's a campaign mode and a cinematic mode, and cinematic mode is basically designed for one shots that reflect the structure of the films in the Alien franchise, where there's probably not going to be many survivors by the end of it. And so you're, like I said, you're playing with a pre-gen, playing with house money, and so you can go wild, getting stressed, and having some fun with some of the craziness. I will add, so there's another game that we didn't talk much about, Mothership, which is sort of very Alien with the serial numbers filed off in a lot of ways. Like the four core classes, at least in the first release of the book, are the I don't remember what the terms are, but it's basically a kind of like laborer type, a sort of do it all, kind of like Ripley. And then there's Marines, and then there's androids, and then there's scientists, I think are the four. And one of the cool things that Mothership has that Alien does not is that every class has a specific thing that happens when they have a stress-based breakdown, which I really like. I really like the idea that you have this kind of determinant of how you react to the critical moment based on kind of what you do and who you are. In some ways, I think it can be a little inflexible in Mothership, but it can be almost too flexible in Alien, is what I will say. That I guess what I'm saying is, if you want to run the Alien RPG, maybe read Mothership, and that'll give you some ideas for how to run it well. Or if you want to run Mothership, maybe read Alien, because there's some cool ideas there. But I really like the idea, for instance, like that Marines always go wild with shooting when they have a stress breakdown. That's their response to chaos is, when bad things are happening, well, at least put lead down range, versus like the androids. I think androids have a different stress thing, but like the kind of regular people, their response is basically like cower and hide, figure out a safe place to hide out, while the Marines are sending lead down range, basically. And I think that's kind of a cool thing. And then the last one I wanted to mention is a game that I have never actually run, but I think is really interesting, called Patrol. Patrol is by Newsstand Press. And there's a couple of versions of it, essentially. But the original game is designed for playing in the Vietnam War, which obviously comes with a whole set of sort of warnings around it, I guess we should say, that, very sensitive topic with a lot of, in a way that kind of World War I and World War II, I think, don't have the same sensitivity today that Vietnam does, and all of that sort of stuff. And in particular, we learned a whole lot about the nature of things like PTSD from what happened to people coming back home from Vietnam. And that's really an important development with an unfortunate kind of raison d'etre. But in particular, one of the cool things that system does is that it's a D6 dice pool system where you roll a pool of dice. Sixes count as successes, and you need a certain number of successes for the target number of what you're doing. And ones don't count as failures, but they count as basically complications. If you roll as many ones or more ones than the total successes, then you get what's called a foobar. If you succeeded, so you can succeed and get a foobar, or you can fail and get a foobar, or you can succeed without a foobar or fail without a foobar. But basically what happens is that the character still succeeds. The most interesting result, in my opinion, is the character still succeeds, but there's a sort of moment of chaos as they do something. There's an example in the book that there's an interrogation, and one of the characters is holding a pistol in the face of a villager, and trying to intimidate them, accidentally pulls the trigger and shoots them in the leg. They succeeded at getting the villager to talk, because of course the villager opens up right away, but it's a bit of chaos introduced into the system. And I think that's another kind of interesting way to model this idea, because that ties in with the whole idea of stress, because that game has a whole thing where you don't have a class. You do have like a what do they call it, James? MOS? Is that what the Army calls it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But you also have a like personality form, for lack of a better term, which are basically all based on characters from Platoon. And it basically refers to kind of what your character believes in and how they respond to things, right? Do you believe in the Great Crusade against communism? Are you there to, stick with your buddies? Are you somebody who is, basically a pacifist who has been drafted? Or I don't remember the last one, but they're all interesting things. And they all similar to this idea in Mothership that your class defines how you respond to these stressful moments. In Patrol, I think one of the really cool things is that your character's sort of defining personality element defines how they reduce stress or whatever it's called and how they accumulate it. And so in that situation, part of the point was that the character was not believes in the cause to the bitter end type thing. And so he did not want to shoot the poor villager who got shot in the leg, and therefore got a fair bit of stress or trauma or whatever it's called in the system for the FUBAR.
Yeah, so maybe that's something. Let's put it.
Well, that's a complicated thing.
I was going to say
introduced a lot.
No, that might be a future game though. In
maybe
sensitive
we're talking
games.
About
Later down. But let's
topics in gaming. That might be an interesting.
Yeah, that might be an interesting thing. But let's kick to Carl for his final thoughts now.
Oh, I think it's a great. I think it's a very important discussion. Again, since BJ started at the beginning, and Arlen echoed that we should not get our idea of sanity and mental illness from these types of games. And I think we covered a lot of different games and wide games. I can't think of any that we may have missed. I'm sure there are. And of course,
I can think of some.
Yeah, of course we. There's some new games coming out. I'd say like Weird Frontiers and Grit, but there's similar mechanics to me that other games have. So, that's why you as the listener can call in and tell us of some games that we might have missed.
Well, with the caveat, there are definitely a ton of games we missed. Maybe games we missed that have a more unique spin or a different spin than these games, because there are a bunch of games we haven't mentioned.
Kind of an interesting twist on the idea.
Yeah. So I since we opened up in episode 1 with BJ, I think it's only fitting that BJ close us out.
I would just echo what Carl says. You are emulating a genre fiction when you engage with madness, sanity, mental health issues in these games. So make sure you understand that's genre emulation, not the way it works in the real world. We've probably beaten that horse to death, but it's probably one that deserves a few more whacks for anybody who hadn't got the message yet.
And I will. BJ, once you're done, pass it to me.
I would just say, on the other hand, to the extent that this might help people be more aware that, let's keep in mind there are horrors in the real world. Maybe they're not supernatural or arcane in nature, but people go through some bad things a lot. This is a way to open up a dialogue or to explore your thoughts on the matter, or role-playing game can be therapeutic for people in certain contexts. But I guess my final thought would be kind of unrelated to the gaming is, we know a lot more about these issues than we did even 20 years ago, but you don't have to suffer in silence. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, reach out, try to get help if the real world is crashing in on you and you're suffering from anything like this. But gaming can be a good, healthy outlet for using your creativity and you're exploring your thoughts, as long as it's done in a kind of a safe, healthy way.
And I will add on top of, we've sort of talked about the idea of, taking this issue seriously, being, not using the game as if it is a model of kind of real world issues, and be sensitive to the fact that, anybody at the table might have experiences that you don't know about that are worth considering at least the possibility of. And I will add to that also that I think most of us are in agreement that gaming ideally is fun, and that there are plenty of forms of things like mental trauma that are not necessarily going to cause anyone to have a panic attack when you talk about them, but also might not be very fun to play. And it's probably worth talking to your group about what sort of style of game you want to have, what sort of things are not just not off limits because they will upset somebody, but also what's actually fun, right? I tend to think that barbarians who carouse to the point where they can't remember what they were doing for the past week is fun, but that at the same time, there are sort of other coping mechanisms that people use to deal with trauma that are not nearly as fun to play. And so basically what I'm saying is that I think we're all in agreement that it's probably worth having a part of a session 0 conversation with the table about what everybody is interested in exploring, what they're interested in and comfortable with having in their game, what fits the style of the game, because there are plenty of games. I mean, we talked about the Conan stories in the way that Conan doesn't seem to have any type of long-term trauma from having to fight for his life every 2 weeks or so, unlike sort of a real person who would be going through that, it seems like. And that, that I will just add, finally, in addition to all of the sort of, safety concerns or comfort concerns, that there's also an element of, games are supposed to be fun. Don't give your players a mental health issue that they're not going to have any fun playing, because I don't think that's appropriate either.
Unless you're playing by the rules, in which case,
unless you're playing by the rules, if you have a degree of fidelity to the rules that transcends fun, I think that is totally appropriate, because the rules are greater than fun.
Because we have heard people say that role-playing games are not about fun. So
I know.
But that's
and also changing the rules
for another day.
Pretty seriously manipulative when the GM changes the rules.
Yeah, that's a discussion for another day. Let's put a pin in there. I'm going to give some phone numbers out here in a minute, but go ahead, BJ. I'll let you finish.
I was just going to say, Grimdark is a popular. It's its own sort of genre that you can apply to fantasy, to modern games, to sci-fi, but. Grimdark can be fun when you use sort of dark humor.
Yeah.
Grimdark can be like one of the fastest way to me go, I think I need to find a new game, is when we just want to sit and wallow in the misery and there's no tongue in cheek. There's no, and like Warhammer, if you look at the old original Warhammer stuff, it's hilarious because it's a satire of bureaucracy and human stupidity and naivety, and at some point, some subset of the Warhammer fandom has turned this into like just an exercise in misanthropy and antisocial behavior for the sake of that, not for the
right. And that's why I stick with the older versions. The good thing is there are more games out there now than ever. They're lighthearted, including a new one by Modifius called The Troubleshooters, which is meant to emulate the European BD comics, the Belgian and French comics. And The Troubleshooters, you're going to hear more down the road from us on that. But that's a great game. There are a lot of great lighthearted games out there. If you're in trouble, though, folks, luckily, the U.S. is finally kind of waking up. We've had a suicide hotline for a long time. It's in the show notes. It's 1-800-273-8255. But in July 16th, 2022, and which won't be too long after this episode's published, the U.S. is going to a universal number for a 911 or mental health emergency hotline. It's going to be 988. So you can't dial it at time of publication. But after July 16th, if you're ever in that really dark place, all you have to do is dial 988 if you're in the U.S., all you have to do is dial 988 on your phone. It's going to get you in touch with somebody who can help you. So we're actually moving forward as a country in these things a little bit as well. So, help is out there. Definitely reach out. Use your lifelines, your support networks. And if you don't have one, there actually is one out there that will help you. So you don't have to feel alone. But I kind of, unless anybody has a last minute alibi fire, I'd like to kind of cut it off here if we could.
I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah. So I want to thank everybody for joining this discussion. It's an important discussion, and we might revisit this on our individual podcasts or even here again in the future, or we'll see what kind of calls we get, as Carl mentioned. As you hear in the buffers before and after our panel discussion, you have the ways to contact us. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we look forward to talking to you again in a couple weeks. Take care.
See you later.
See ya.
Yeah.
A Nerd Central broadcast, cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the spinal tap straw. All styles and pods past, cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something's plenty, oh seriously in your brain, baby. What I mean is this is shades of fake, and from what I understand, don't look now, the Super is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. We can bring it, we've been piling above in any order. Just another ring of legal tossers running for the border. Just a snack like a running disaster. Beer and beer, respected buzz. You can eat on a bacon, and his customers never say it. It's savoring the flavor of the movies it created.
But why don't we do that? Why don't we open up with the other games? So we're going to put Arlen in the hot seat, and
All right.
and then we'll roll from there. So let me do the intro, and we'll roll from there. Okay, BJ, I need a C flat from you, Carl. A, I don't even have musical notes, so I can't. Never mind. There we go.
A is like
See, so you guys are way talented. I'm not even. I suck. Okay. Now that we got that out of the way, let's